Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this dialogue with Mr. Paul Volcker. You see, Paul, you're so great, you get applause without saying anything.
I quit.
Anyway, as you all know, at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I have a tradition of making 3 points in the introduction, and this is what I'll do today. My first point, of course, is about the topic, which is the global financial crisis. And I think one point on which I think we will all agree is that we are truly entering uncharted territory. Nobody seems to know what the hell is going on. I mean, 2 weeks ago, I was in Paris, and on the very same day when the European leaders met all night, at 4 a.m., they came out and said, "We've saved the world. We found a solution for Greece." And then a week later, Greece changed its mind. And then, of course, you had another crisis. And then this week, guess what? Greece is no more on the front page. Now it's Italy on the front page. So this is what's happening. And clearly, we are living in amazing times. And really, very few of us, or in fact, probably none of us, understand what's really going on. And this, of course, brings me to my second point, which is that if you had to have a dialogue today with one human being in the world about the global financial crisis, I suspect that number one human being in the world is Mr. Paul Volcker. He is very modest. He will not agree with me. But I can tell you that there are very few people in the financial world who are as highly respected and as highly regarded as Paul. As you know, he's been a living legend for many times. He saved the United States in the late 70s, early 80s from the stagflation. And then, after stepping down, his stature kept rising and rising. Now, don't believe what I say. Just listen to what some very distinguished people, what they have said about him. I think you've all heard of David Rockefeller. And David Rockefeller says this: at a time when a number of business leaders have betrayed the public trust upon which their power, position, and ultimately the prosperity of their companies depended, Paul Volcker stands out as a financial leader of unusual competence, unquestionable diligence, and uncompromising integrity. And that's the word that's always associated with Paul Volcker. Let me just say what a former chairman of the US SEC, Arthur Levitt, said. Now, when anyone is drawing up a list of people to head an important public commission, Paul Volcker heads that list. He's often the only name on that list. There are too few private sector leaders who appreciate the responsibilities that they have to the rest of society, who understand that the expertise needed to navigate the challenges before us, and who recognize that their interests are served when they serve the public interests, unquote. And that's Paul Volcker. But of course, let me just have one more quote from somebody whom I think you would all agree he was a very tough critic of all human beings, and his name is Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And if you read Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's book, Hard Truths, and I recommend the book to you, this is what he says about Paul Volcker, and I quote, "Paul Volcker is an unusual man. He's a very able man. He had a very small salary. I once asked him, 'Why do you do this?' He said, 'In Princeton, we were nurtured to be of value to our society. And even when he retired, he didn't go and make money. He's on the board of the Lee Kuan Yew School for free. In Indonesia, he was on the advisory council chairman for free. Now he does this job for Obama, probably also for a small honorarium. He's the most unusual man, but he thinks he's got enough. The only position where he would have made some money was when he joined James Wolfenson in a boutique investment firm. But that's him, and you're not going to find many Paul Volckers in America. That's how unique Paul is. And I can tell you that if you're looking for someone who you might appropriately call the Nelson Mandela of the financial world, I suspect it's going to be Paul Volcker. Well, all this brings me to my third point, which is also a very important point. First of all, I'm going to begin by thanking all of you who paid $100 or more to attend this lecture. But only 100 of you out of 800 paid $100. And seriously, if Paul Volcker, who doesn't live in Singapore, can give so much of himself to the Lee Kuan Yew School, as Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, for free, surely some of you can give $100 or more, right? So when you go home tonight, after you've enjoyed this conversation, please send us a check. For that, you got to have applause. And now we can begin our serious dialogue. We've agreed that Paul will make some brief opening remarks, and then I have about 68 questions to ask you in 30 minutes. So,
my opening remarks will be very brief, but you've disappointed me in this introduction. I always thought Lee Kuan Yew was a man of modesty who always told the truth. And when you said that somebody ought to be here that had the best view of what's going on in the world, I immediately thought of Lee Kuan Yew. So you've got to put up with me instead of him.
I can also agree with that, too.
You can agree with that. Let me say it's been a pleasure to be here in Singapore for several days. I am on the board of the Lee Kuan Yew School, and it's remarkable the progress that school has made in public policy, public administration, very important subjects that too often are neglected, but Singapore has a certain reputation for public administration, so I think there's a special role for the Lee Kuan Yew School to teach the rest of us how to run a government efficiently, and lots of questions about that around the world. I just want to make a couple of remarks to put this in a little bit of perspective. If we'd been meeting here 5 years ago, and I was here 5 years ago, and you'd asked me to make some remarks, it would have been in the middle of a period of really extraordinary pleasure with what was going on in the world. We'd gone through a decade of rapid growth all over the world. I think we were growing in total at 4% or more, which I don't think had ever happened before in all of human history for the whole world to be growing that way. And of course, in the so-called emerging world, the rate of growth was double that, more or less. And people seemed rather content. They were rather confident in the financial markets. They were doing all kinds of complicated things. But the bankers at least took credit for helping us all along. And then if that was 2006, by 2008, it had all fallen apart. And we had the greatest crisis that anybody could remember, almost the greatest crisis in any of our lifetimes. Now, not quite in my lifetime. I was alive in the Great Depression. But I wasn't very conscious of it. So this has been an extraordinary period, and it kind of reminds us of how, in some sense, how little we know, how difficult it is to forecast in this great human adventure. But the present state of the world economy, I might even say the present state of the world political situation, is not a very happy one. It's going to be, I think, a bit of a struggle that's going to require a certain amount of patience before we are more satisfied. Somebody told me I was here last year, and the report in the press and what I said is we need patience.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that's what I would say this year, too. We still need a little patience. But with that much
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask questions in 4 or 5 big areas, and I'm going to begin with the number one issue of the day, which is Europe. And it's sort of stunning that this continent, and both the United States and Europe were the two pillars of the global economic system. And what makes the global economics so shaky is that the two pillars are shaking now. So let's start with the first one, Europe. What do you think is the root cause of all the problems that Europe is facing today?
Well, when you look at Europe, And what's the cause for all this strain in Europe? It has some resemblance to the whole world economy. What's happened in Europe quite clearly is under the cover of this common currency, which is going to prevent problems, or at least that was the hope, it instead encouraged some continuing big imbalances between different member countries of the euro. And what you found in particular was that some of the countries on the so-called fringe and the southern side of the European zone, which were basically probably weaker economies than the northern area of Europe, found that they were able to borrow at lower interest rates than they ever could have imagined, because the basic interest rates for the euro, in the context of price stability, were set basically by Germany, which had no inflation, had a strong economy, and low interest rates. So there was a great temptation there, I think, for other countries that were not as strong but had reasonable prospects to luxuriate in their ability to borrow, basically from other European countries, but from anybody at low European interest rates. And that facilitated a high level of consumption in some of these countries. It facilitated a housing bubble in a number of countries, in Ireland, in Spain in particular, somewhat resembling what went on in the United States. But eventually something happens and you run out of the ability to borrow so easily and you have a crisis. Now it's interesting, I could extend this to the world. What happened to that very nice picture we thought we had 5 years ago? Well, in this case, it was China
and the US
providing all kinds of liquidity to the United States at low interest rates. And we couldn't resist borrowing back our own dollars and pumping up consumption in the United States and eventually creating a great housing bubble in the United States, which contributed then to the great crisis we had. But I think the underlying problem in Europe has been this imbalance between countries and without any central authority to either control the economic policies, at least limit them individually, or to call an end to the financing before it caused a crisis. And that's a big issue for Europe looking ahead. Are they going to get more integrated with more, essentially, central control over budgets and over other instruments of economic policy? But in the meantime, they've got a financial crisis.
But if the European leaders called you, if the European leaders called you for a meeting today,
I couldn't imagine that.
And Paul, they begin by saying, you know, we are in trouble.
Too late.
No, come on. Let's be serious. No, they call you and they say, you know, we are in trouble. Come on, you know it.
Right.
Tell us, surely there's some quick fixes that we can do?
Well, there's some quick fixes you can do with this particular situation. But the quick fixes aren't going to solve the basic problem of more central control. But when you look at what's going on in Europe, and they've done it with great hesitancy and great difficulty and great political, understandable differences and conflicts, but what are they decided, at least in concept, on three things that I think are essential. They want to get the banks that are vulnerable, and many banks in Europe that are vulnerable because of the crisis, get them recapitalized. And if they can't recapitalize themselves, they're going to have government recapitalization. And that takes, well, it's a question how much it takes and whether they provided enough money. But it will take a couple $100 billion euros in any event. Then you have to, given all the uncertainty that exists, countries like Spain and Italy that are so much in the news are going to have to continue to borrow for a while in big amounts, even if they do the most perfect economic policies in the world and moving back toward equilibrium, it's going to take time. And with all the uncertainties, can they be financed? And that will take a big bundle of money available. If it's available, it may not be needed. But if it's not available, you're going to have a crisis. And they provided that to some extent. And the third thing is, in some cases, and Greece is the prime case, under any reasonable prospect are they going to be able to meet their debts. And the conclusion, finally, after much struggling, is no, in the case of Greece, they're going to have to be, to put it politely, some reorganization of the debt. We can't quite call it a default. That's a forbidden name at the moment. But they are having debt relief. So you get this combination of recapitalizing the banks, which is necessary to prevent the spreading crisis, to provide enough money to finance the countries that are in a difficult process of reorganization themselves, and finally, in maybe a few cases of banks themselves are going to have to fail, and at least one country, you've had a quasi-default. Now, all those elements are in place. Are they in place enough? Have they provided enough money, enough certainty, enough confidence for recapitalizing the banks? I think it's a little questionable. Have they provided enough money to provide assured financing for Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, if they need it, and they all do need it? It's again questionable. They're in the right direction, it's the right concept. Have they done it with enough force and energy to convince the markets to settle down? I think that it's quite possible that they can do that, but and it's very difficult for them to get together with the different political concerns that exist, political concerns in the countries that are borrowing, and are asked to. They're already in recession. They're already in large amounts of unemployment, to be even more restrictive. And then the countries that have to provide the money, directly or indirectly, like Germany, there's a little bit of a political problem to tell the German taxpayer that they have to provide money for what they might view as the weak sisters in the southern part of Europe. So I think it's a doable thing, but it's very hard. If you were dictating, you could get it done. Because there's enough resources in Europe to do it. And if there weren't, you could go to the rest of the world and ask for some help. And the rest of the world has a big stake in this, so there's no reason why, in normal circumstances, just a question of providing some liquidity for Europe, that could be done too. But things are hanging in the balance, whether it's going to be done with enough force. And when it comes right up to it, and it's kind of a hair trigger, they somehow have the resolve to deal with it. And I expect that will be the case again, but I wish it'd be a little more forceful and comfortable so we could
But you just said something very significant, You said that they have the resources in Europe to get it done, which means that, and this is a point that I met Jacques Attali in Paris. I met two people in Paris. Jacques Attali was more optimistic. He said, look at the incredible amount of wealth that the European countries has. Look at the amount of wealth that Italy has. If you could marshal that wealth, Italy has the wealth to overcome its problems. On the other hand, I also met another guy who's known as Dr. Doom, Nouriel Roubini, and he was very pessimistic. And he thought that, the Europeans just can't do it, and this is just temporarily buying time, and that's all they do, kicking the can down the road, buying time, but in the end, things will crash. So are you in terms of your own...
They're both right.
Huh? They're both right.
They're both right in the sense that Europe could do it.
Yeah.
Europe is a still
continent.
Rich area, high standard of living. The Germans are running a big surplus. Europe as a whole is running a big surplus internationally, or if not a big surplus, or at least in balance. So they're not looked at. Europe as a whole, they can manage it. Will they manage it? When you're not talking about Europe as a whole with the European government, you're talking about however many countries there are, what is it, 17 or whatever it is, in the Eurozone.
Yeah.
And the big ones, which you have to count on, all have their own political problems. Look at the United States. I can tell you what the answer is to all budget problems in the United States in theory. But in practice, you have the same kind of argument going on rather furiously in the U.S. political scene between those that say, I don't want to pay any more taxes, and you use it for all those social programs, or other people, I don't want to pay all those taxes for a big defense program. And the other side says, look, we're a big, rich country. Our tax burden isn't so great. We can work through this problem. And they certainly are right. We can work through the problem. But will we? Will we reach the political accommodation that's necessary?
Yeah. Before we switch to the US, let's just go back to Europe for 1 minute. At the end of the day, 6 months from now, 1 year from now, what do you see as the likely scenario unfolding?
Well, I would hope that they would get through this immediate strain, which is very real. I think they are going to have to become a bit more ambitious, and hopefully a little more than a bit more ambitious in the amount of money that would be available to help finance the countries that inevitably have to borrow. If that was done, and those countries continue with their adjustment program, I would hope for a year from now, enough confidence will have returned so that the market itself would produce the money. People would be quite willing to lend to Spain and Italy because they would think the prospects are reasonable. Right now, that's in doubt. So, but that can be changed in a year. So,
well, one of the points that somebody in Europe made to me was that he said that if Berlusconi stepped down, if he was replaced by Mario Monti, then immediately the markets would have a much more positive view of Italy, and suddenly everything would change.
You know, it gets so silly in a way that I guess Mr. Berlusconi says he will leave at some indefinite point. And the mere fact he said he's going to leave at some indefinite point, the markets go up. Now, you know, whether he leaves or not doesn't change anything very fundamental. But it's a question of what confidence people have in the leadership and what can be done. And indeed, in this case, the countries in Europe that have to provide the financing, basically, do they have enough confidence in the leadership of the other countries that they will willingly provide the financing? And those are all kind of tough problems.
Yep. So let's turn now to the United States of America.
Everything is so easy.
Everything's very easy. No, so I mean, you mentioned earlier that the United States, if you could sort of persuade everybody to come together, let's raise taxes, let's reduce the deficit, you would begin a virtuous circle and so on and so forth. But as you know, the surprising thing is that everyone knows what the answer is, but the answer is not happening. Why is that so?
Well, I have never seen the political situation in the United States so ideologically driven, so much discord, so much straight political opposition in various directions. And the problem, again, like in Europe, is very real. We haven't got an immediate emergency. The markets continue to finance the United States at very low interest rates, but we face a yawning deficit in the future. And we can't sit here and assume that markets are going to continue to finance us without taking constructive action. But how do we get there? How do we break through this really an ideological logjam and an unwillingness to reach the kind of compromises that typically in the end the United States has reached? You have people in the Congress who are used to working with each other, and when the crisis looms, constructive action is taken. I hope that happens now, but right now it's not happening. It'll be interesting. We have this special committee, whatever it's called, of Congress. There are 12 senators. And
super committee, isn't it?
Super committee, I guess it's called. And they have been given a great authority to reach an agreement on the budget.
Yeah.
And if they don't, then other things are supposed to happen automatically that nobody will like. Arbitrary reductions in expenditures and in revenues for a limited period of time. Now, you would think under the pressures with reasonable people understanding what the problem is, they'll come up with something that's reasonable. And I don't know, maybe they will, but it's going to be at the last minute if they do it. And it will involve the Republicans, at least one of them. All you need is a majority. You just need one Republican or one Democrat to move to get the majority that's necessary. But presumably you're going to have to get at least one Republican to say, yes, I will stomach some increase in revenues. And you're going to have to get one or two Democrats to say, yes, I'm willing to cut Medicare or Social Security. And neither of these have to be huge. I mean, these are changes that can be made that are not impossibly large. But it's become so freighted with ideology that it is very difficult to bring people together.
You were a close advisor to President Obama. I mean, I remember seeing lots of pictures of you next to President Obama at the crisis and all that.
Didn't give him enough of good advice, I guess.
Sorry?
Maybe he didn't take it, I don't know.
Maybe, so either you didn't give good advice or either he didn't take it.
No, well, my role there could be greatly exaggerated. I was the head of this advisory board, but the advisory board was not part of the administration, and there was a lot of division of opinion, actually, on the advisory board. So I think we did some helpful things, particularly in the area of financial reform, which, of course, I was particularly interested in, but it was not wasn't a central policy-making body by any stretch of the imagination.
Are you happy with the way the Volcker Rule has been implemented in the U.S. Congress? Do you think that they have done enough to put in the kind of safeguards you wanted, or do you feel
I don't know what all these people know about the Volcker Rule.
I suspect many of them have heard of it, but you can explain the Volcker Rule to all of them.
Well, this is an element in banking reform and financial reform in the United States. And we had this is an international problem, but each country has its own angles and has to participate. The United States, obviously, is pretty important. And we do have a big, complicated piece of legislation called the Dodd-Frank bill that was passed, I guess a year ago now, with a good deal of controversy. It's a big, complicated bill, 200 or 300 pages long, which gets a lot of criticism. And that bill has a lot of things in it. But one thing it had in it was something I had been urging with the president, and he gave a little name of the Volcker Rule, which said, to put it most simply, that if you are a commercial bank, and commercial banks have essential functions in any economy in handling deposits and making payments and making loans, through history, commercial banks have a central role to play. And through most of history, they've been protected one way or another by various government organizations, by the central bank that provides liquidity when they're in trouble, many countries, including the United States, insurance of their deposits, and strict regulation. And that's an advantage for banks because the market senses that they're protected. So in disturbed situations like the present situation, they can get financing more easily than most financial institutions. So the basic question, or one basic question that arises is, should those financial institutions called banks that have an essential function and are government protected and supported, should they engage in essentially proprietary activities, speculative activities, which is not really related to their basic function, and should the taxpayers' potential support be put behind that kind of activity, which may be all right or not be all right, but it shouldn't be supported by the taxpayer. There are extra risks involved, so to some extent you jeopardize the stability of the banks. And one of the points I keep making, which isn't always understood, that the participation of these, it's just a handful of big commercial banks in speculative activities with great big bonuses and huge compensation affects the whole value system and the whole institution. When you have traditional conservative commercial bankers seeing that other people in the bank are making tens of millions of dollars or $5 million and taking risks and getting paid immediately for when those risks are successful, they say, well, maybe I ought to be taking a few more risks myself and see what we can do. So I want to see some separation between that so-called proprietary activity, hedge funds, equity funds, and straight-out speculation. Remove that from commercial banks. If you want to engage in that kind of activity, fine, but you shouldn't be a commercial bank. And so a number of big institutions are now going to have to scratch their head and decide whether they want to continue to be a commercial bank and stop doing proprietary business, or say they want to go back to their traditional proprietary business, but then they're going to have to give up their banking license. Now, this has given rise to a great big complicated regulation, much more complicated than I would like to see. But that is partly a reflection, not just of this rule, almost any rule you have now in the United States. The lobbyists come out in force. There's no set of lobbyists in the United States bigger, more important, and with more money than the financial community lobbyists. We've got a big modern city down there called Washington, D.C. It is very prosperous, not because of government salaries. It's a big, prosperous city because all those office buildings are filled up with lobbyists and lawyers whose whole function in life is to complicate legislation or to change it. So you see that being fought out now, but the basic legislation is pretty clear. It says no proprietary trading, very limited hedge fund or equity fund, and then they come back and say, well, what is exactly a proprietary trade? And you give us a very clear definition. We want to do this a little more or that a little less, and you end up with, well, actually the rule itself is only 35 pages, I think, but it's got a lot of appendices. So it is long and complicated. I wish it was much simpler, but the basic intent is there.
You know, I can understand, Paul, why in the field of politics you get a gridlock, because, you know, the two opposing sides are playing a kind of zero-sum game. The Democrats and the Republicans, one wins, one loses. But in the field of finance, surely the banks, can't they see it's in their enlightened long-term interests to have simpler and clearer rules that would then have greater public confidence in their institutions, well, you know, and they'll benefit? Why are they shooting themselves in the foot?
Well, it is odd that this ideological dispute does go out and color the consideration of financial reform, which you would think should be less ideological, is clearly needed. You ask anybody in the street, do we need financial reform? They're all going to say yes, whether they're Republican, Democrat, or whatever they are. But nonetheless, the ideological cleavage exists to the point that you can't get through it even on stuff that should be more technical. The biggest political issue in this complicated Dodd-Frank bill was not what we were just talking about, or some other financial stuff, but consumer protection. There's a portion of the bill that put in much stiffer rules as to the rules you have to follow or the disclosures you have to make when you're lending to individuals on a credit card or on a mortgage or whatever. And there are more detailed rules than we ever had before. And that did create an ideological split, but once that was in the bill, the Republicans said, we will not vote for that bill. We will not provide one vote for the whole bill because they don't like that provision. Now, they may not have liked some other provisions too, but it would not, I know for a fact that there were, because I've talked to them, there were Republican senators that certainly thought we needed financial reform. We're certainly willing to talk about the Volcker Rule, but talk about other elements in reform. But the decision was made politically. If you are a Republican, you shall not vote for that bill. And that's been true of other bills as well. And it's important because for some reason, I know we're getting a little technical here, but in the US Senate, the habit has arisen that unless you have 60 votes, a minority of 40 or 41 votes can prevent a bill from being taken up by the Senate. So you don't need a majority. All you need is 41, and you have complete party discipline. You've got to get 60 votes to get it passed. And the Democrats didn't have 60 votes. They had 59. And finally, on the whole bill, in the dead of night, they corralled the 60th vote by making some compromises. But that's why there hasn't been much constructive legislation, because it's very hard to get 60 votes if one party says under no conditions will they vote for the bill.
Just one more question on this regulation. On the one side, you have the lobbies, and I saw an estimate that they spent $1.3 billion lobbying on the Dodd-Frank bill. And on the other side, we have Paul Volcker. Who else is on your side?
Well, this is going to sound egotistical, and I'm exaggerating a bit, but I cannot walk down the street in New York and go very many blocks before somebody is pulling me by the shoulder and say, "You keep at him now, don't let him change." Nobody ever comes up on the other side and say, "No, you're doing too." The general public, it resonates that something is wrong in the financial markets. I think they're right. And the fact, to put it in very simple terms, the taxpayers shouldn't be standing behind speculative activity. It's a very simple message. And no question, if you had a free vote on this, who would win?
So did you start the Occupy Wall Street movement?
I don't quite understand that. I was disappointed the other day. Now I'm in Midtown. The Occupy Wall Street movement is, it's another country. It's downtown. It must be 2 miles away. But I had to go down there the other day. I had to go to a meeting at the Federal Reserve, which is, I discovered, only a block away from where this is taking place. But I can attest, at least from the standpoint of being a short block away, it's a very quiet, orderly sit-in. Now, exactly what they want isn't very clear.
Okay, in 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to invite you to come in to the mics and pose some questions. But before that, let me just turn to the third big player on the global scene, and surprisingly, the one that the Europeans believe can save them, that's China. So what do you think is China's role in all this?
Well, China's a big country.
I agree.
It was a big country 10 years ago, but we didn't quite realize it. It's made a tremendous increase in its economy in the past 10 or 15 years. I don't think there's been any time in history when any country, certainly of any size, has grown at 10% a year on the average, or 9% or whatever it's been over that period of time. And so many, hundreds of millions of people have kind of been brought into the modern economy rather suddenly. And it is obviously a force in the world economy. A few years ago, thinking of the so-called emerging world, what's in your head when you think about the emerging world, at least in America? Those are the people we have to help. We're going to offer them all kinds of assistance, and we got the World Bank, and we got aid programs and all the rest. The emerging world is now as big as the developed world. I mean, that's a phenomenon of the last decade, basically, and it requires a really change in thinking. And China's out there, and China wants to have something to say about the world. They've got their own internal problems. Biggest manufacturing country in the world. Probably in 10 or 12 or 15 years, its economy will be as big as the American economy. They're only halfway there at the moment, but they're going to get there. And that's a different world economically, and it's a different world politically. You know, in a way, we like to think in the United States that we were the great proponents of open trade, open finance, get the barriers down, non-discrimination, going back to, you know, Bretton Woods and the end of World War II. And now we have pretty much approached that ideal of free trade, certainly free finance. And the huge beneficiaries have been the emerging world, because they were able to find markets and find finance and find technology that otherwise never would have been possible. So this has worked out extremely well from the standpoint of the welfare of the world as a whole and the emerging world. But it also creates a different kind of power relationship in the world. And the Chinese are going to be a big force, and they've been preoccupied with their internal development. But if they're going to be a constructive force, they have to begin thinking about the impact they have on the rest of the world. And whether all the policies that they have, which might, in the immediate sense, seem to be to the benefit of China, may not be sustainable, and are not sustainable, to put it bluntly. They cannot continue to run these big surpluses on current account and expect the rest of the world's going to have a deficit, and particularly the United States is going to have a deficit if they keep running that kind of surplus. China is an economy, now a big economy. If I remember the figure correctly, consumption as a percent of the GDP in China is 35%.
In America, it's 70%.
They talk what?
In America, it's 70%, right?
In America, it's double that.
Yeah.
But any advanced country, it's going to be
60,
2/3
70%.
or so. That's what economies operate for the benefit of consumption. Investment in China is bigger than consumption. It's not a natural state of affairs in equilibrium for any economy. And they're going to have to make an adjustment. If the United States is going to adjust, we've got to do the opposite. We've got to cut down on consumption. But we're talking about cutting down on consumption means cutting down 5% maybe to get back to normal, of 6% or 7% at the most. And we want to raise our investment. We want to raise our exports by, say, 5% of the GDP. And that's a big challenge. That's part of this, what the budget's supposed to be doing, to make that kind of adjustment. China's got to go from 35% consumption to, I don't know, 50, 60% consumption at least. It's not quite double, but, well, given the growth, it's going to be double in a few years what they're now doing. And they're going to have to cut back on the amount of investment. They've got an awful lot of infrastructure. They can't continue to spend half the GDP on investment. And they understand this. And they say, we have a 5-year plan that'll make some progress. Well, we got 5-year plans too. But,
United States doesn't have a 5-year plan.
Pardon me?
United States doesn't have a 5-year plan.
No, we have it in our head. We ought to have a 5-year budget plan. We do kind of have 5-year budget. We have 10-year budget plans. They're not very satisfactory, I'll tell you. But we do have projections, what we like to do. But no, we don't have a specific plan of different areas of the economy to the extent that they do. But the adjustment problem they have to make is the mirror image of what we have to do. But the relative amounts are bigger there, much bigger. And, their consumption, look, suppose they're growing by 10%, which is not, seems like an unbelievable number, but they do it. And their consumption is 35%. Well, just with the economy growing by 10%, their consumption would go up 10%. That's a big increase in consumption in 1 year. But if they're going to increase consumption from 35% to 45%, consumption isn't going to go up just 10%. It's going to have to go up 20%. And it's going to have to go up 20% for quite a few years. And that is an enormous difference. That means consumption doubles every 3 years. When you put it that way, you realize what a big adjustment problem they have. Now, again, they won't quite do that, but they got to move in that direction. Now, they still have an awful lot of poor people that once they get into the market, obviously they got the potential for raising consumption way up. But it's unbelievable the rate of speed that it has to rise at.
So what's your last question? What's your advice to the Chinese government? What should they do with the euro, and what should they do about the US?
Well, I think the Chinese, I think Chinese leadership understands this in a general way. They have to press ahead with this kind of adjustment they have to make. And it's not, there's a lot of talk about the exchange rate, yes, and I think the exchange rate would help.
Yeah.
But it's not entirely a problem with the exchange rate.
So the exchange rate itself won't solve.
Exchange
rate itself will not solve the problem.
No, well, it may go in the right direction, but it's not. The exchange rate could change by 10% and the problem wouldn't go away, I'm sure of that. But the mentality is, if you want to invest in China, they're all right, we'll let you invest, but what are you going to do for us? Are you going to export a lot more? Well, are you going to invest in some part of China where we want to tell you where to invest? Do you want a lot of our intellect? There's a big issue with China is intellectual property. Can you invest in China and export to China without giving up your intellectual property, which is a major comparative advantage that we have and the Europeans have at this point, and they're getting it fast enough anyway, but it shouldn't be done by fiat. Okay,
let me pause here and throw the floor open for questions. Please come to the microphone and identify yourself and a short, sharp question. Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Paul Volcker and Professor Kishore Magbani. My name is Vikraman Rajaratnam from Ainsworth Institute. Okay, my question is it necessary for Asian central banks to slash interest rates amidst the financial crisis?
So, repeat your question. Is it what? Is it
necessary for Asian central banks to slash interest rates amidst financial crisis?
Okay. Should Asian central banks slash their interest rates in the current financial crisis?
The Asian central?
Asian central banks.
I'm very modest about the advice I give to central banks.
That's okay. And, today you're allowed to be slightly
modest. That includes my own central bank, and it includes Asian central banks too. But China in particular, I don't know about every Asian country, is in a kind of difficult situation at the moment. They've been increasing so fast, and a lot of debt has been created, and they've begun to have an inflationary problem. So they've tightened up a bit, and understandably. And now there is a question, and I'm not close enough to it to give you a good answer. Is their economy somewhat vulnerable? And instead of just a little slowdown, they'll have a tightened financial system that will produce too much of a slowdown from their point of view. So you ask whether they should be easing up. Look, that's a judgment I'm going to leave to the Chinese, because it's a very interesting period of moving from restraint to less restraint. I don't think they're going to have an easy money policy or other Asian countries, but less restraint is a reasonable question.
Yeah, Professor T.N. Srinivasan, the Yongpang Hao professor at our school. Please go ahead, T.N.
Sir, you're justly celebrated for breaking the back of raging inflation and rampant stagnation. during the post-second oil shock era of the late 1970s. Currently, China and India, the other country which has not been so far mentioned in this discussion, are experiencing sustained inflation. And arguably, China has deliberately slowed down its economy in response to the rising inflation. India, on the other hand, in its traditional muddling through policies, has raised the interest rate 12 times or 13 times in the last 18 months or so, with no impact on inflation, but on the other hand, visible impact on growth. Now, if these two countries, one deliberately is going to slow down its economy, the other, whether it wants or not, is slowing down the economy anyway. Now, what will the impact in the short run will their slowdown will have on the rest of the world?
What would be both China and India are slowing down their economies, and India, as you know, has raised interest rates 12 times. So what would be the impact of the slowdown of the Chinese and Indian economies on the world?
Well, I'm not going to be any expert on the Chinese and Indian economy. I've already exceeded what I know. But, you know, some slowdown from economies that have been expanding very rapidly and are in danger of building up inflationary forces. They both have more inflation than they had. It's not terribly dangerous at the moment, but if you permit that to continue, it could create a real problem. So some slowing down would be entirely appropriate from my point of view. And it's not in itself. There's still a favorable force in the world economy, not as strong as they were the last few years. It's been very helpful in the short run for China and India and some other Asian countries to have this extraordinary rate of growth right when the developed world was in a big recession. You can't expect that to continue. We can't sit in the United States or sit in Europe and expect to be bailed out by a great surge in growth in Asia. But we'd like to see the growth continue for sure. Yeah. But I think that's a manageable problem.
Okay, let's go to the lady over there, please.
Mr. Volcker, this week in the Seem to
Can you just identify yourself if you don't mind, just to...
Oh, I'm Jane Peterson, fellow American with Chelsea Park Partners. This week, Nassim Taleb, who wrote Black Swan, wrote an editorial, and he was basically arguing that bonuses for any institution that borrows from the Fed should be eliminated. Do we have any chance of seeing that happen?
I can either say unlikely or no. Take your choice. I understand the sympathy, you know, have some sympathy for the point that's being made.
Yeah. Gentleman in front here.
My name is John Koneman. Dr. Volcker, has the United States fallen into a liquidity trap similar to Japan's in the 1990s? Money multiplier is less than 1. The monetary stimulus has resulted in $1.6 trillion in excess reserves.
I mean, the answer to that is yes, of course. There's some similarities in our situation, and certainly in kind of textbook terms, we have a liquidity trap in the sense interest rates can't go below 0, and that's where they've been. So you lose force from monetary policy. But to put it the other, why are we in that situation? Why was Japan in that situation? Why are we in this situation? It comes back to the basic problem of overborrowing, over-leveraging. We're all caught in a kind of debt trap. And when I was discussing the situation in Europe, same thing. That's the problem with Greece and Spain and Italy and Portugal and Ireland, you name it, we all went on a borrowing binge. And it was quite comfortable while it happened. But when it goes too far, you're stuck. And it's very hard to get back. For the economy to grow, you have to have some borrowing. But when you already got more debts than you can handle, it's hard to get the borrowing going again. And that was true in Japan, and true in the United States, and true to some extent in Europe, to a large extent. But you know, people, the American economists were very fond of criticizing Japan until we got in a similar problem. But what Japan had, you know, almost unprecedented, they had a real estate bust much greater than ours, and they had a stock market bust greater than ours, and they had them both at the same time. They had real estate prices going down by 75%. We think we're in a terrible bind in residential property when it went down 30%. It's a big problem. And our stock market went down, I don't know, plus 50%. Theirs went down 75% and stayed down. And that is not their banks were stricken, they were insolvent basically. The government protected them. And nobody thought 10 years ago it was going to take this long to come out of it. I think they were beginning to come out of it when then the worldwide crisis hit. But it's a good warning for us that we're not going to get out of this in a hurry either. So I think there are some similarities. I don't think we're going to take as long as Japan, but the American economy, the outlook is for growth too slow to substantially reduce the unemployment rate for a year or two. It's not a very happy situation.
Thank you. Gentleman over there, please. Yeah.
Yeah, good evening, Dr. Volcker. My name is Ranjit Nair, and I'm a student of Internet Age Leadership. You mentioned in the dialogue, it was we mentioned about the Occupy Wall Street movement. So today we are seeing many such leaderless movements, and to me, this seems to indicate a disillusionment of the Internet Age generation with current styles of leadership. So I've got two questions for you, two related questions. First, are we seeing the birth of a new leadership paradigm? And the second question is, how do you think leadership theorists should react to the hyper-connected internet generation?
Yeah. There are two questions about in this, are we seeing leaderless movements in this internet age, as demonstrated by the Occupy Wall Street movement, leaderless movement? And the second question about the internet age.
The second question is, how should leadership react to this?
What should we do about the internet age?
What can we do about the internet age?
Shall we go back to the 1930s?
Suffer.
Suffer.
We're not going to do anything about the internet age.
The question is not so much about the internet age as about leadership, providing leadership to this hyper-connected group of people who don't seem to follow leaders. I mean, the Occupy Wall Street, as you mentioned, they don't even have an agenda.
I mean, I think you're getting these social movements everywhere, though. I mean, you're getting them in Chile to some extent. You're getting them. You saw the London burning for a while. I mean, what's happening?
It makes it a lot more difficult for the politicians, I'm sure. And I haven't got any answer. We're not going to change the world of instant communication. Of this guy WikiLeaks or whatever it's called.
WikiLeaks, yeah.
We had this thing I heard on television. Somebody overheard this conversation between Mr. Sarkozy and Mr.
And what did they say to each other?
Pardon?
What did they say to each other?
Well, it wasn't for publication. That's for sure. They were rather critical of one of their
fellow colleagues,
brother leaders. This is a more difficult world to handle, but just looking at it from the United States standpoint, we have these two movements now. We have this so-called Tea Party, which is considered way to the right, religiously evangelical, very strong anti-government feeling by and large. And then we have this sit-in thing in Wall Street, which seems to be to the left, although it's not quite clear what they're in favor of or not. But both of them are unhappy, that's for sure, which is not a very easy way to govern a country. How do we get the leadership out of a very confused situation to deal with this? One element which we haven't touched upon, but it's dramatic in the United States, is the distribution of income has veered way in favor of a very small group at the top, 1% or 1/10 of 1%. And we have a period of time, and this isn't supposed to happen. It doesn't appear in economics textbooks. We've had growth in the economy over the past 15 years or whatever, 10 years, of reasonable amount. But the typical American family has not had any increase in real income for that period of time. And in a way, it's interesting that it's taken this long to kind of evoke a political reaction. And part of the argument is we got in this hole of all this borrowing and all this debt because people's incomes were not going up, but they acted like they were going up and went out and bought the new car, the new refrigerator, or the new house, because they wanted to maintain a rising standard of living when their income wasn't there. That period's over. We've got to adjust. And whether we'll do this, where we're going to be tested clearly is, can we get some kind of national consensus on constructive policies instead of being torn by these groups at opposite ends of the spectrum, which is very unnatural for the United States, very unnatural during my lifetime. It's happened before, but we've had a political system that has gone toward the middle consistently, and that's in question now.
So do you agree with Warren Buffett that the rich should pay more taxes?
No, I wouldn't mind that, but no, look, our tax burden is not overwhelming. This business.
So do you think?
And just take this. This has become a very hard issue from people that have hundreds of millions of dollars, and politically, to have any increase in taxes on those people has become a huge political issue of a sort that would not have been. And the tax rate now is about, it's not quite as low as it was a few years ago, but it's not dissimilar either. You know, we used to have tax rates like other people, the top bracket, 50%, 60%, 70%. We have nothing like that now. But this is one area, the congressional business that I mentioned before. The line has been drawn very strongly against any tax increase. And some people say it's not only against any tax increase, it's against any revenue increase. If you close a loophole or two or some other way of raising funds that you wouldn't ordinarily think of as new taxes, that's verboten. It'd be very interesting to see whether this special committee is able to make any progress in this area.
Yeah. Okay, now I see lots of questioners. Can you please make your questions sharper and shorter, please, because I see you have 20 minutes and 7 or 8 of you there. Please, gentleman in the back there, yes.
And I apologize a little bit. I'm old enough so my hearing is not what it once was.
It's okay, I'll repeat the question.
If I don't want to answer the question, I'll say I can't hear it.
Lim Sui King from Singapore. Okay, within a few months after 2007 crash, the whole world pumped about $1.5 trillion to fund the banks. And that is enough to purchase 200 years of 737. But this money did not create any jobs, except a few persons go to St. Regis and enjoy their time. So, is it more important for America to invest that money to rejuvenate the aging infrastructure and create jobs than pumping into the banks and get speculations out of hand and investment banker become a commercial bank.
Okay,
Thank you.
So his question was, you had this huge stimulus package. Why did you spend it on infrastructure that could have created jobs? Why did you fritter it away? Where did it all go?
Well, there's a lot of feeling that the stimulus package that was enacted, and it's pretty big, in 2009, was not as effective as it could have been because it was sprinkled around quite a few areas.
The lobbyists took some of it, right? The lobbyists took some of the lobbyists took some of the stimulus package.
Particular lobbyists, but a lot of it went to state governments, which were in trouble. And, it was a reasonable point to say the federal government at a time of great stress for state finances provide some assistance. A lot of it went to more unemployment insurance and that kind of thing. And ideally, I think from a lot of people's points of view, some of it went for infrastructure, but not enough. And one of the reasons that was done was maybe lack of enough political discipline. But when you're in the midst of the crisis, the recession crisis, you can't turn on infrastructure, important as it is, overnight. It takes months, typically, a big infrastructure process. You'd be lucky if you can go from planning to real work short of a year or two. You can do some little things, but if you're really going to have a big infrastructure program, you can't do it in the space of a year. And I did sit in a few of those meetings where this was discussed, and the president said, we got to have more infrastructure, we got to do this, that, or the other thing. And he said, right away, I'm sorry, you can't do that because you can't do it in such a hurry because it violates local building codes, it violates local zoning patterns, you'll get this problem, that problem. Now there is a chance here, I would think, in any constructive resolution of our fiscal problem, it can't be all reducing expenditures or all raising taxes. There's some expenditures that should be increased, and infrastructure is one of them, because we have a big infrastructure problem. So when you look at the budget in a 5-year perspective, or a 5 to 10-year perspective, there ought to be room for a significant increase, in my opinion, in infrastructure spending. Now, having said that, I'll tell you one of the problems is 90% of the infrastructure spending in the United States is done by states, not by the federal government. So it raises all kinds of questions about the relationships between the federal government and the states. So, but there's no question there ought to be more emphasis on the infrastructure, in my mind, in most people's mind.
Paul, you have to keep your answer shorter also, so we can finish. Okay, next question in front here.
I am determined to make the answers as long as the question.
Okay, short question, short answer. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kenji. I'm a graduate student at Monash University in Australia. I've got a question about political economy.
Political what?
Political economy.
Political economy. Political economy.
One of my professors argues that in a crisis situation, it's innate in politics that a government turns to a Keynesian and just spend billions of money in infrastructure projects, expansionary monetary policy. Do you agree on that? That it's a political consequence in the wake of a crisis that...
No, he's saying that in a crisis, the Keynesian response comes out. Governments spend more, have looser monetary policies. Is that right or wrong?
Well, that's a fact of the matter, yes. You get a crisis, that's the instinct. And I don't think it's an inappropriate instinct, but there's a limit to how much you can do without jeopardizing, I think, the prospects in the future.
Great. Gentleman over here in front here. Yeah. Then we're going to move quickly, short, sharp questions.
Sure. I'm Fan Chen. I'm an economic student in Singapore Management University. I have 2 questions for you. Firstly, recently Professor Christina Romer published an article in New York Times, and he proposed a new policy framework for the Fed, which he called targeting nominal GDP. And he mentioned Dr. Paul Volcker in his proposal about his policy of targeting the growth of money supply back in 1970s. So may I know what's your opinion on his policy, his proposal of targeting the GDP? And my second question is more about philosophical question. When you were the chairman of the Fed in 1970s, you witnessed a shift in Keynesianism to a more pro-free market thinking. So after this economic crisis, do you see any maybe sign of new economic thinking emerging from this economic crisis?
Yeah, well, two questions. The first one was about a proposal by Christina Roma in the New York Times. Did you see that? Christina Roma.
I know who she is.
She had a proposal in the New York Times where she quoted you.
She quoted me?
Yeah.
Well, if she quoted me accurately, it's a terrific problem.
I couldn't quite get what the proposal was, but the second question was, do you see any kind of new thinking coming out in the field of economics as a result of this crisis?
You want me to be short. If there's any discipline, any academic profession that needs help, it's the economics profession, in my view. And this crisis and what's happened demonstrates that. We need some fresh...
So the economics profession is lost?
Pardon me?
The economics profession is lost, do you think?
Well, I don't want to make them totally lost, but they've wandered in the wilderness. And there is an effort led by George Soros. He's put a lot of money into this to encourage new economic thinking. But frankly, economists have gotten so wound up in esoteric mathematics. And it's very complicated mathematics, but very simple-minded economics, in my view. And they had a degree of confidence in what they could do and forecast that was totally unwarranted. Now, I think they've learned a lesson. You can extend this to financial engineering even more clearly. It's complicated markets with all these very sophisticated models. What the economists have forgotten about, and certainly the financial engineers have forgotten about, is that an economic system is not a physical system. It doesn't follow the physical laws of cause and effect with the certainty that you do in the physical world. So everything to a physicist looks like a normal distribution curve. And they develop, all these mathematical economists thought they could analyze everything in terms of normal distribution curves. And these things are happening. They're only supposed to happen every 100 years. Well, they're off the end of the frequency distribution curve. We don't understand it. What they didn't understand is that human beings can be very awkward. They change their minds every day. And they change their mind today on the basis of what happened yesterday. And that's not what happens in the physical sciences. And they led us down a kind of garden path. Now that is being corrected. One of the symptoms is a recent Nobel Prize in economics was given to a psychologist. I mean, that never would have been thought of a few years ago, but it's a reflection of the fact that the economists have the economics profession had to wake up that it's not a physical science. It's a social science, and a social science, to the degree it's a science at all, a social science deals with human beings.
That's a wonderful answer. Now, over there, quickly, short question, short answer.
Yes, yeah, fellow Princetonian, financial regulator. Question is, how do you think the Dodd-Frank bill, in particular the Volcker Rule, differs from the UK's ring fencing legislation? And how do you think the two financial sectors will be affected differently, if at all?
Now, in the US, you had the Volcker Rule. In the UK, you had the ring fencing method. Right. How do they compare, and how will they affect New York and London's financial centers?
We'll have to see. First of all, I want to take advantage of being here in Singapore and in Asia. And I was in Japan recently and haven't been in China, but all these banks do not basically do the kind of thing that the Volcker Rule rules out. And so they ought to put that in their law so that their banks don't go down the garden path.
In Asia.
In Asia, yeah. Well, now we take the UK, the other big market. And their government originally expressed its sympathy for the Volcker Rule, but then they got to work. And they are preoccupied in their special commission, who's made a report that I might say is even longer than American legislation. And their approach toward the same problem is to isolate what they call a retail bank. When you look at the fine print, it's not just retail, it's a bank. Could deal with retail people, it could deal with businesses too, but it's a deposit-taking, lending, money movement institution. They say, we want to isolate that, and you can do this other kind of activity, including proprietary trading, but you've got to do it in another subsidiary that's going to have a big, big wall around it. And that subsidiary will never interact with the other subsidiary. So that the bank, with its essential service, the same philosophy I'm expressing, can be protected and in effect indirectly subsidized by the government. But that other part shouldn't benefit from government support at all, even though they're going to be in the same institution. Now that's a tricky thing to apply, so we'll see which works, but they're both aimed at the same structural problem. I think the logic, frankly, of the British thing is to say, they just have to go one step further and say, yes, we want to isolate the bank from everything else, but they can't be in the same holding company. I mean, it doesn't take much for them to say that. They say everything but that. So we'll see how that comes out in the end. And they've got a long phase-in period. And I don't know which way the banks like the least, but they are similar in philosophy. But the important thing in both cases, in terms of financial reform, the most important single effort in the American legislation and in the British approach, and presumably in the continental European approach, although I don't think it's in law there anyplace, is the so-called resolution authority. What's a resolution authority all about? This is to say, we do not want the government bailing out big financial institutions anymore. We don't want the taxpayer at risk. We don't want those institutions to anticipate a government bailout when they get in trouble. So how are we going to do that? We're going to create an authority, or use an existing authority, to take over a big failing institution and liquidate it. And in the process of liquidating it, we will continue to meet its immediate obligations so that the whole market is not upset. But that institution will not survive. It can be merged maybe with another one. You can sell it off in pieces, but the stockholders will be gone, the management will be gone, and the creditors will be at risk. Now that's in the American law. That's bluntly as I have stated it. There's still a lot of skepticism in the market as to whether that sounds good, but when push comes to shove, that's not what the governments will do. Because the temptation will be, they'll be frightened of the side effects, so they'll bail them out. So it hadn't been, well, it's had a very minor test the other day in this American institution that failed. It wasn't big enough to be a real test, but certainly with no question of government support there, and the creditors are at risk, and the institution will disappear. But one of the problems with that approach is these big institutions are operating all over the place. American institutions are certainly in London, and they're on the continent, they're in Singapore, they're in Tokyo, so forth and so on. So you're going to liquidate, take over and liquidate one of these institutions, you run a big problem because they got international operations all over the place, which may be under, and will be under, a different legal system. So there's going to have to be a lot of cooperation, which they're working on. I'm not closely involved in it, but I'm involved enough to know that there are interesting conversations going on internationally as to how to achieve some coordination and how to liquidate a big failing institution. But that's, potentially that could be the most important part of this.
I can see that this subject is close to your heart. It's very difficult to give a short answer to this question.
Well, he asked a question.
A lady over here.
My name is Lily Fang. I'm a professor of finance at INSEAD. I have two questions. So first is actually on the Volcker Rule, which I have a paper studying banks' involvement in private equity. So my question is, why stop the Volcker Rule at commercial banks? If the key issue is government guarantees to too big to fail institutions, this certainly applies to investment banks also, and they're engaged in private equity, hedge fund type of activities. So why sort of stop this regulation at the commercial bank and leaving out the investment banking sector? The second question is, what would you do if your name were Ben Bernanke?
If you what, sorry?
What would you do if your name were Ben Bernanke?
Okay, the first question was, why are you limiting the Volcker Rule only to commercial banks? Why not apply it to investment banks too? And the second question is, what would you do if you were Ben Bernanke today? If your name was Ben Bernanke, what would you be doing today?
God bless him. On the first rule, you just have to understand, and be encouraged to give a short answer, that the Volcker Rule is perfect.
Hey!
Properly interpreted. No, but the idea is that the bank shouldn't do it, but the activity is nothing the matter with the activity in principle. If people want to speculate in markets, it's okay. And hedge funds serve a purpose, equity funds serve a purpose. I just want somebody else to do them that's not going to be protected by the taxpayer.
Well, I mean, the banks, the investment banks, they also are too big to fail. I mean, if the issue is too big to fail,
well,
we're talking about banks.
You're saying that if investment banks are too big to fail too, shouldn't they be also?
Oh, the investment bank is not going to be. The theory is, as I just explained at too great length before, hopefully, the big investment bank fails, it's going to fail. It's not going to be bailed out. That's the theory.
So now, even if it's too big, it'll be allowed to fail. That's the answer. Next one over here.
Thank you. I'm Joshua Green. I'm teaching economics at Singapore Management University right now. I have a question for you, Dr. Volcker. What is your assessment of quantitative easing and how it has been used thus far?
QE1, QE2.
Or more QEs, whatever.
You want a short answer, right?
Yeah. Brilliant, though. Brilliant.
It's more talk than it's worth.
There's more talk than there is what?
Than it's worth. Right? I mean, look, it's just a method of putting more money into the system. Now, what they're doing now is a little different. The so-called
Now they're doing Operation Twist.
Twist. I am so old that I know about Operation Twist in the 1960s. That was only 50 years ago. I was in the U.S. Treasury. I conducted it in some sense.
So you were twisting
Twist,
them.
but it's a little different. They're trying to get long-term rates as low as they can get it. So they're buying long-term bonds. Now, I am also so old, when I got into this business, when I was in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in early 1950s, I was on the trading desk, as a matter of fact, at one point in my career. We routinely bought Treasury bonds for the Federal Reserve. Now, not in huge volume, but in those days it was cricket, to use that phrase. If the Federal Reserve thought interest rates were getting too high in the long-term market, you might buy a few, or they're too low, you might sell a few. In fact, during the war, they participated in the long-term bond market all the time. Now, that became a no-no in the mid-50s, there was a big argument about it. And the argument was, no, the central bank ought to confine itself to the short-term money market. And while that never became 100% true, it became about 99% true for the Federal Reserve, and it was true for the European Central Bank, too. Now, given present conditions, the Federal Reserve has abandoned that approach for the time being. European Central Bank has abandoned it, too. And, you know, I think it's a reasonable, in the midst of an emergency, you do these kinds of things, quite reasonably.
Quick question here, please. Yes.
Dr. Volcker, I'm David Tai with Bank of Singapore. As a follow-up to the ATM machine, is there another financial innovation you would like to see for this world? Maybe not for any one of us in this room, but perhaps for your great-grandchildren?
I'd like to see some financial innovations reversed.
You mentioned that the ATM was the only financial innovation you've seen, right?
Yeah, he wanted to see, he asked whether there are others that I would like to see. I want to reverse some.
You want to reverse them?
Yeah.
So you want to reverse all the financial innovations?
Well, not all of it. I got my selected. I mean, I'm not so hard on credit default swaps, if you want to.
Next question.
Afternoon, sirs. My name is Lian Wee King, fund manager by profession. I've got 3 very short questions.
Maybe
Volcker?
just one, because you know we are 7 o'clock already, and
okay, all right, they're related. Dr. Volcker, you have been in public service most of your life. May I ask, sir, what values and principles guide you, or are most important to you, as you were developing a public policy for your country? And what advice do you have as an American and a former regulator to offer to my country's civil service, or those who seek a career in the civil service in this regard?
Okay, what values guide you, and what advice do you have for the Singapore civil service? What values guide you? Values. And what advice do you have for the Singapore civil service?
Singapore civil servants. No, I'm going to go back to this previous question because I'm haunted by a headline that's going to be in the Wall Street Journal. Volcker says get rid of credit default swaps. That's the trouble with short answers. The trouble with credit
Come on,
default
it's good to be have a headline in the Wall Street Journal.
I'll come back to the civil service in a minute. But credit default swap, a good example of an innovation which had a pretty clear rationale of providing an opportunity, a better opportunity in some people's minds, protecting against the portfolio, the risk in a portfolio of a default. That's the way it started out, not very many years ago. Didn't exist, but within 10 years, or less after it was invented, what did we have? At the peak, we had $60 trillion worth of credit default swaps outstanding, presumably providing protection against something like $6 trillion worth of debts. Now, somehow that raises a question in my mind, I don't know about your mind, as to what distortion of function has been created. It obviously became a kind of speculative vehicle.
Yeah, you've taken care of the Wall Street Journal now.
Okay, so the Wall Street Journal says, I'm in favor of credit default swaps rationally used, conservatively used. Now we're back to civil servants.
Values.
My understanding is that civil servants in this city-state are extremely well paid.
It's supposed to be as... and you approve of that?
I approve of that. Not exceptionally well paid, appropriately well paid. I mean, it's unusual, actually, but, you know, you have, for better or worse, you have a reputation in this place of running a clean, efficient civil service. And I think that's a great advantage. That impression does not exist in the United States to the extent that it should, frankly. I think the whole business of public administration has gotten too little attention. It's not a very glamorous subject. Our best and brightest don't want to kind of dirty their hands with these troublesome questions of effective public administration. They all want to talk about great policy. You know, we want to do away with this or that, or we want to support this or that. Look, take two recent examples in the United States. We want to deal with natural disasters in the most efficient and effective way. And we have a big department that's supposed to do that. And that big hurricane came along a few years ago that swamped New Orleans, and we found out we did not have any efficient, effective public administration to deal with the situation efficiently or effectively. More recent one, this big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. We have rules about protecting drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and what safety precautions you have to take and what procedures you go through. And then one of the things blows up and you find out that it was not effectively administered. So we can say, great, we have all the great policies at protecting the environment in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's not effectively administered. You in fact don't have anything. And too often people want to debate about the grand policies, but they forget about the grand policy has to be administered if it's going to be effective. And so I think I encourage the Lee Kuan Yew School to do attention to these problems of administration. In an environment in which I think traditionally this political entity has given a lot of attention to it. It's reflected in part by the pay. But it's not just a question of pay. But
yeah, thank you for reinforcing my message that they should support the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
That's right.
The last question, I'm sorry, with apologies to everybody, to the lady, and then we'll close shop because we're past 7.
Hi, good evening.
Quick question, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
My name is Chuan from Standard Chartered Bank, also a part-time student in the master's program, Financial Engineering. I will remember what you said with regards to using normal distribution for our modeling, but assured that we use that only as a base case. My question is something that's closer to home, which is our Singapore dollars. Sing dollars has been increasingly seen as a safe haven currency with the likes of the yen as well as the Swiss franc. And this is pertinent, especially when we're seeing more fund houses as well as institutions using Sing dollars as safe haven currency. Now, the key question is Singapore having its unique use of our currency as a form of monetary policy tool. The question is, how then can Singapore have control over our monetary policy?
Singapore dollar, as you know, is being used by others as a hedge or whatever it is. How does Singapore get control of its own currency when others are trying to use it as a hedge?
Oh, that's too technical for me. It's you young people have to worry about that. I just want to say one thing. I don't think I want to answer your question. I'll answer a different question, or comment on a different question. Singapore has been remarkably successful in maintaining reasonable stability in its exchange rate. You are 5 million people in one city, basically, with your own currency, and a well-developed financial system. And you would think you'd be very vulnerable to every swing in psychology or speculative pressure in the world. But somehow you've managed that very successfully. And I remember a few years ago, I was surprised by your success. Maybe it was 10 years ago, and I asked the then Deputy Prime Minister how this was all done so successfully. He sent me a long answer and explained it all to me, but I probably didn't understand it well enough. You've had some very sophisticated and able people running this thing.
Well,
I won't worry about them losing control.
So on that high note, I think you'll all agree with me that we are very privileged at a time when the whole world is lost and trying to figure out what to do about this rather strange financial universe we are trying to sail through. You at least heard from one man who seems to understand exactly what is going on, who also, by the way, gave very good advice. And if only the world would follow his advice, believe me, it would be a far better world. So please join me in thanking Paul.
Thank you. Should we get down here?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.